Salamon. I grew up with Amy. My dad's story is one that I don't think a lot of people know. There's not a lot of, and I'm not trying to make it sound old, but there's not a lot of him left where they can tell the story. And a lot of the stuff is becoming secondhand knowledge. And growing up with my family, I didn't know a lot of these stories. And I knew my dad was a Holocaust survivor, but it was like, you're a Yankee fan, you're a Holocaust survivor. I didn't put it together how bad it was. And as he started writing this book, I would get drafts. And I remember being up with my wife reading and being like, this, I gotta call my dad, this can't be true. And I'd be like, Dad, how much of this did you embellish? I mean, come on. And he's like, no, that story. And he told me more of the story behind the book. As I was going through the screenplay and the book, and I was like, every story was true. And this is how I found out my knowledge of what my father went through and my family. Because when we were growing up around the dinner table, this wasn't conversation. So for me, it was a big educational event, learning about my history and the unfortunate events that occurred. Reading the story itself is something I think it should be knowledge that is passed on to our kids. I feel like it should be part of the educational platform. And he'll tell a story, and you get around to reading his book, you're going to realize that a lot of this knowledge should be handed down because it happened. And there's no way around it. This is something that happened. This is an unfortunate event in our history. But a lot of the stories, I encourage you to ask questions because, like I said, there's not a lot of my dad left where people can find out more personal details. That said, I will turn it over to my dad. Oh, okay.
Can you hear me? It's Charlie. Thank you. Okay. Before I start my story, I want to tell you I was born left-handed. And in Europe, at that time, are any of you left-handed? Okay. Well, in Europe, they encourage you to be right-handed. In fact, later on, it had an effect on me. But what happened when I was 8 years old and I was going to school, my teacher forced me to become right-handed. And so eventually I accepted things right-handed. I started writing right-handed. Now I do things, some things left-handed, some things right-handed. But as a reward, the teacher gave me a notebook. And by this point, when I was 8 years old, I will tell you the story, what happened to me before that. I felt that significant things were happening to us, and I started writing down all that happened to me. And I kept a diary for over 60 years. And I wrote down things that I recalled. I wrote down things that I interacted with my parents and also some surviving members of my family. We lost over 50 members during the Holocaust. So let me start my story. I was born in 1934 in Sudetenland. And let me just see. Here. I was born over here, near the border of Germany, in Leitmeritz. And my parents were concerned by then what was going on in Germany. In 1934, already there was a great deal of anti-Semitism in Germany. In fact, the Dachau concentration camp has opened already. And so a lot of information was filtering over to where my parents were. And, but they were stuck with me because I was a newborn, and they felt that they would stay put in Sudetenland, hoping that, that things will die down over there and die down in Sudetenland. By the way, Sudetenland, there were 3 million German-speaking Czechs living there, and they were quite sympathetic with what was going on in Germany. So apparently we were living there and in 1938, 1938 was an eventful year. I was 4, and in March of 1938, at the demand of Hitler, Austria was annexed to Germany. And he started talking about he wanted Sudetenland as well. But nothing happened as yet. And during the summer of that year, my parents started thinking about leaving that area and going to another country. And they heard that there was a conference that was called by President Roosevelt of here in Evian, France, where nations got together to discuss the possibility of letting Jews come in to their countries. And the only country that agreed at that point to increase their quota was the Dominican Republic. None of the others did. And so my parents, they gave up on it. And my dad had a good job. And in fact, he received a bonus. And he did something. He made a mistake where he paid off the house where we were living. And he felt that he should use the bonus for that. And he did. And come September of 1938, Hitler received Sudetenland. It was an agreement that was negotiated between Prime Minister Chamberlain of Great Britain. So he accepted, of course, Sudetenland, and they were going to occupy it on September 30th, and my parents decided we had to escape. So we abandoned everything, and we escaped to Prague in 1938, and my parents felt it was a good place for us to be, because that was the capital of Czechoslovakia, and so we were there, and then there was more threat that Hitler was going to come into Prague. And my parents tried to give me away to a Swiss Gentile family. And they took me to this organization that was going to do the transfer of me to them in Switzerland. And my mother told me that I started screaming when I realized what was happening. And they backed off, and they said, well, we were staying together. So where my parents were born, do you still have the map, babe? Yeah. I want the other one. Where my parents were born in Czechoslovakia, at one point it belonged to Hungary, but when Czechoslovakia was formed after World War I, it became part of Czechoslovakia. But Hungary became an ally of Hitler, and Hitler, as a reward, gave him back this region of Czechoslovakia to Hungary. And that's where my parents were from. So now they considered that they were now Hungarians. So when Germany invaded Prague, they felt they would be safe in living in Hungary because they were Hungarians. But not me, because where I was born, I now belong to Germany. I was a foreign born, and so we got to living in Hungary, going from place to place to place. And when I was 7, my parents, particularly my mother, was concerned that I couldn't speak Hungarian. My native tongue actually was German. I spoke Czech and German. In order for me to go to school, I needed to learn Hungarian. So my parents decided that it would be good for me to be with kids my own age, and in the summer camps I could learn to speak Hungarian. And so they arranged for me to go to this summer camp in about 60, 70 miles away from Budapest. And I was there for a few weeks, and all of a sudden gendarmes, which the Hungarians call their police gendarmes. They had foot-long plumes in their hats and they bayonets, real mean people. And they came and they called out the names of 33 of us, me included, all of us who were foreign born, and we were told we were being transferred to another camp. Of course, we didn't know what kind of a camp it was. You have that, the map of the... So we were in Budapest, and we were being transported to Slovakia, to Garai. And along the way, the train stopped in Budapest to refuel, and my parents had gotten wind of the transfer, and they were there with all the other parents, and I was pleading, particularly my mother, to take me off the train. I didn't want to be there. And my mother went to the side of the train car where I saw her. I was by the window, and I saw her go to the end of the train car where one of the gendarmes was standing guard, preventing us from leaving. And I do remember to this day how the gendarme just waved her off with his bayoneted rifle. And she ran back, and then the train started moving, and I remember my dad handing me some coins as he was running along the train while it was moving, and then it sped up, and I remember my mother screaming, "I'm going to come and get you." And those words stayed with me. I mean, I was just 7 years old, and I was scared, obviously, and it stayed with me, and I was taken to this place, Garai, which was a fenced around internment camp, and there was a guard tower with machine gun, and the gendarmes and the Hungarians, they were all standing guard. And virtually every day I would go to the gate, to the fence by the gate, looking for my mother. And I did this for close to 6 months. And after 6 months, a black car showed up, and lo and behold, my mother emerged from the car, and a man had been driving, and my mother was wearing something white. I think it was a white dress. And she came out, she got out of the car holding documents in her hand, and one of the gendarmes who had come up to inspect, I saw him rifle butt her to the ground. And I must have screamed. And then the man in the car jumped out and came up and showed the guard some emblem, some documents showing that he was a government, he was from the government. And they came to get me, and they reunited me with my mother. And I was taken back to Budapest, where I got reunited with my parents. And it was a wonderful moment because I don't think I knew that I would ever see them again, I guess. And so I got reunited. So how did my mother do this? I learned later on. She, one of the landladies loaned her a cross. And she put on the cross, and she went to this priest. And she confessed to him that I was taken away, but that she was not Jewish. But she made the mistake of marrying a Jew. And he, without a word, gave her a baptismal certificate and signed it and told her to fill it in. And then she took that baptismal certificate to the Department of Interior in Budapest, outraged say, outraged, why am I being punished for having married a Jew and taking away my son, who's not all Jewish, he's only half Jewish. And that's how, well, there was a postscript to the story, which I found out after she had gone. She slept with the Department of Interior man who agreed to come take her to Goran to get me out. So that was the price of freeing me, not the fact that I was so-called half-Jewish. So this was in 1941. And 1941, by the way, was a god-awful year that started for the Jews, particularly in Ukraine. Jews were being transported to Ukraine in places, if you look it up, actually I saw some write-up on it, in Babi Yar, Odessa, and Kamenets-Podolsky. Over 100,000 Jews were massacred, many of them from Hungary. And my mother had told me at one point that the other 32 children had never returned. So I had to assume that a lot of them ended up at these massacres in 1941. And it was a very tough year. We were moving from place to place. All told, we moved over 50 times. We moved from place to place, and then in 1942, one day when my dad went to the synagogue on Fridays, he didn't come home, and it turned out he had been taken away with the other Jewish men into the Hungarian forced labor camp, where in 1942, Budapest experienced its first bombings, and they felt they needed firemen to put out the flames. So they drafted people and trained them to be firemen. My dad was one of them. And he had a real close call, I found out later. He was standing on the line to be trained as a fireman. There was a Hungarian soldier, and there was a building with a ladder against it. And my dad was ordered to climb up the ladder with a hose and put it on in the window on the second floor and come right back down. And my dad told the Hungarian, can I get my jacket? And the guy said, okay, go get the jacket. And he was going to the truck, and the Hungarian soldier was impatient and had the second man go on the ladder. And my dad told me he heard the crash, and the ladder had broken, and the second man fell to his death. And my dad hid in the back of the truck where he supposedly had his jacket. And they put the body, the Hungarian put the body in the truck to get rid of it. And at some place, as the truck was going back into Budapest, my dad managed to sneak off it and come back to us. So that was the event in 1942, one of the events. And we were in jeopardy. Every day was a problem. It was one of the things that happened in school. One of my schoolmates, when she went home, she discovered her parents had been arrested and taken away. She became homeless. And so I was scared going to school, and because I was afraid that every day I would come home, I would not find my parents. So it was a tension-filled time, and that was one of my fears in those days, and the other one was, will I be eating that day? Eating, because there was a shortage of food. And 1943 was particularly difficult because my parents had part-time jobs. My mother was waitressing a little bit, and she would bring back some food and stuff, but not enough. And thankfully, there was a woman named Rose Kemeny, I feature her in the book, who had seen me and befriended me. And in fact, the way I met her, we were living in a house where there was a courtyard, and then there were the floors, and all the apartments were connected. And we were just living in a half a kitchen, by the way. We had, at that point, the landlord gave us half a kitchen to live in. There was a bed in the kitchen. And I was outside, and this lady, Rose, was on the second floor on one of the balconies, and I remember her calling down to me and saying, "Kishfiu," which in Hungarian means little boy, and she called me upstairs, and I went up there, and she introduced herself to me, and I was being polite with her, and she insisted I call her by her first name, which was unusual. So because my mother said I should be respectful with elderly people, so I managed to call her Rose, and every time that I called her Mrs. Kemeny, she would just say, "My name is Rose, remember that?" So she gave me a piece of chocolate, well, which was a chocolate, I mean. So I took the chocolate, and I went downstairs, and my mother, when she saw me with the chocolate, she said, "Who gave you that chocolate?" And I told her. She said, "You're not a beggar, take it back." And I did. I went back upstairs and I told Rose, "I'm not a beggar," and I reluctantly handed it back. She says, "I want to talk to your mother." She came back downstairs, she went inside, she came back out. She said, and I remember I wrote in the diary, "Am I in trouble?" And she said, "No, go back in." I went back in, and my mother said, "You can eat the chocolate." So subsequently, because my mother had a lot of pride, but subsequently what happened is that she became a friend, and she was more well off than we were, obviously. And she became concerned about me not being fed and not having enough, and my mother lost her job, and then my father was again redrafted. There were a lot of complications, and she insisted that I should eat with her family once a week on Saturdays, and she arranged for 6 other families to feed me, 6 other Jewish families to be able to feed me once. So I did this for close to a year. In 1943, I was eating with these 7 families, and on Mondays I had very nice people. They had me sit on their balcony, and I could take in the sun a little bit. And they were very nice. And then when I would get a dessert, I would pack the dessert. I did this signet. I would pack the dessert. I said, "This is for my mother." And they would always give me a second one. So this was the cue. So every day I packed the same dessert. So this was 1943, and things were getting more and more difficult, and there was a hopelessness. We didn't know where we were going, and I didn't know. I started having this feeling, will I ever grow up? That was an obsession. Will I ever grow up? Will I ever be an adult? And then came 1944. In 1944, in March, Germany formally occupied Hungary. They occupied it. And at that point, in June, before I tell you about June, the first thing was that all Jews had to wear this size of Star of David. This is the same size on the left side, And we were allowed to go out in the street 3 hours a day, maximum. So here my mother was very concerned about me because I was still left-handed. I could not act with my right hand so much. And she was, at that time, a woman who was walking in the street with a Star of David. She stopped at a store window to fix her hair, and she got arrested because when she was fixing her hair, she temporarily covered the Star of David. The law said you cannot cover the Star of David even for a second. It has to be left-handed. So my mother was concerned. She wanted me to go outside and play or just walk and get some fresh air, but she was afraid that I was going to get myself in trouble. So she insisted that for me to go outside, I had to keep my left hand in my pocket. And I could not take it out. If I was outside 3 hours, my left hand had to be in my pocket, scratch my nose, right? And she would train me. She would say, scratch your nose and do that, whatever, to show her that I was right-handed. So this was a difficult time. This was a difficult time for us, but at least we had a certain amount of freedom, the 3 hours or so. So this was after the Nazis occupied Hungary, and then came in June. In June, because of there were a lot of transportations going on, where Jews were being taken away, President Roosevelt, in retaliation, arranged for a carpet bombing. It was just the beginning. There were a lot of them after that. A carpet bombing of Budapest, and this was in June. The carpet bombing is where planes would fly 10, 15 across, and so many, maybe 500 of them all told, and wherever they flew over, and bombs they dropped, neighborhoods would disappear. And in fact, at one of the bombings, the buildings where we were in the cellar, it was just horrifying, the buildings next to each other disappeared. After we were finished, we were the only building standing, except for the other buildings that have disappeared, and the two of them did. So in this particular bombing in June, it decimated quite a bit of Budapest. The Hungarian government decided that Jews were behind the bombing. And they accused the Jewish community that we are communicating with the pilots to drop their bombs where the Hungarian Gentiles live. That somehow we were communicating. And in retaliation, at first there was a talk about executing 40,000 Jews as a punishment for the bombing. Then afterward they decided instead they would confiscate apartments of over 1,000 Jewish families and give it to bombed out Gentiles, Hungarian Gentiles. And so what happened at that point, we were forced to move into a family of families because there were just so many apartments that were available. And we were in one. There were about 16 or 17 families we were together, all together, because all of us were from where we were living. And so we were there, and my mother heard that there was a Swedish diplomat, Raoul Wallenberg, who has come to Budapest and started buying up houses. You want to put the map of Budapest? Started buying up houses and putting up Swedish flags so that Jews could live there. And my mother went to him, and what he was giving out what is called Schutzpass, which is a pass, a protective pass. And my mother got a Schutzpass for us and got us an apartment. This was the Schutzpass, thank you. This was the Schutzpass, and this is where we got the apartment. And the apartment was facing the Danube. You could see the Danube in the distance. This is Buda and this is Pest. And so we were there. The first thing my mother discovered when we moved in is that the gas lines were broken and there was no cooking. Not that we had any food, but Wallenberg's office would make available certain vegetables and stuff, and my mother was going to cook some things from it. But because there was the ovens weren't working, my mother decided that she was going to build an oven. And it became popular. What she did, she went out to the bombed out houses with my dad. At that time he was free, and got bricks and got shells from bathrooms, little metal or porcelain, whatever it was, and was able to make some pipes. And she built an oven in the apartment by the window, by the side window, and was able to start cooking. And it became so popular that the others also wanted to have her build these ovens, and she did. She started building with them, so all that. So eventually we were cooking whatever was available. So we were there in 1944, and at that point we were hearing the cannons, the approaching cannons, and it turned out they were the Russians that were coming closer to Budapest. And my mother and my dad decided maybe what we should do is go out and go to where the front lines are, to get away from where we were. Because they did feel vulnerable in Wallenberg's buildings, because periodically we were invaded by the Nazis, the Hungarian Nazis, and some people were being beaten up. There were all kinds of events going on. So they felt that they should try to reach the Russian front line. So on a Sunday, we went out, we snuck out, and there were a lot of other people doing that too, so there was a whole group of people, and we were moving toward the sound of cannons. And all of a sudden, some gendarmes came, and at gunpoint, they had us stop. And they started screaming at us, and they wanted to separate the Jews from the non-Jews. And in order to do that, they lined up the men and boys on one side, and they had us all drop our pants and underwear. And that's how they separated the circumcised from the uncircumcised. And when that happened, the group that was uncircumcised, they were allowed to go. And the circumcised, we all had to line up against a brick wall. And I clearly remember standing with my mom and dad, and I think I realized that this was the last day. And all of a sudden, there were screams. And who were they? Two men wearing the Arrow Cross uniform. The Arrow Cross was it's called Arrow Cross. These were the Hungarian Nazis. Arrow Cross was like the dyslexic signal like the Nazis had, right? You know, and these two men, these two arrow-crossed men were screaming, "How dare you trying to execute people who dead when it's our job to do it, not yours." And they demanded to know who the gendarmes were, and they got scared and they ran off. When they ran off, the two men, they were wearing hats, they took off their hats. It turned out they were Jews, disguised. They were Jews disguised as arrow-crossmen, and they freed us. And so we went back. We went back to our room, to our house, and decided not to greet the Russians, waiting for the Russians to come to us. So this was in October, and there were other incidents where the Nazis invaded our building, and they went from door to door and were beating us up. Fortunately, for some reason, they missed where we were living, so they didn't come to us. And then came November 9th, 1944, and the Nazis came, and they herded us out of the building. So everybody, they knocked on all the doors, and they herded us out. We went downstairs and outside to the square. This is where we were, right? So outside to the square, and they separated the men from the women and children. And my mother did have a loaf of bread with her, half a loaf of bread. And when they separated my dad, they put him on one side, and my mother was on the other side with me. The first thing she did, she said, she broke the bread and says, "Here, I want you to take it to Dad, but wait, and in order, so I don't look like a boy, you should put a kerchief on me." And I ran off to the side, so I looked like a little bit. So I ran off to the side, and there was a little opening, and I ran to where my dad was, and I handed him the bread, and I remember he patted me on the head, and I came back to my mother, and they took him away. As it turned out, they took all the men away on a forced march from Budapest to near Vienna. Close to 1,000 miles they traveled, they walked. A lot of them, no, not 1,000, I'm sorry. It was hundreds of miles. 1,000 of them were killed along the way if they didn't march energetically. But my dad apparently survived, and they took him away to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, northern Germany. We didn't know this until much later. So we went back to the apartment, and I wrote in my diary, I felt I had lost my dad, that I'll never see him again at that point. And so we were there, and then a few days later, the Nazis came again, and they went from apartment to apartment, and they were screaming at us to go downstairs. And my mother held my hand, and we started going downstairs, and the others they were all herded out by this Nazi, this Hungarian Nazi with a gun by the doorway. They were herded outside, and I guess she felt that they were being taken away too. They were going to be taken away, so she edged to the right, away from the front door, where there was a cart standing next to a glass door, and all of a sudden she lurched against the door, against the cart that crashed into the door in a big sound. still holding my hand, looking dead, but she was squeezing my hand. And I remember screaming to the guard, "My mother died." And then just at that point, his cohort told him, "Let's go, let's go." And he left. And my mother and I went back to the apartment. As it turned out, a lot of those neighbors were killed outside along the Danube. Have any of you been to Budapest at all?
Shoes.
Those shoes, exactly. That's where they were killed, and that was near where we were living. The shoes are around here. Yeah, they were killed. In fact, later on, one of the neighbors, my mother's neighbor, had returned, and she said that while she saw them being killed because she was hiding, she managed to hide behind bushes, and she saw the others being executed. And the way they were executed, because those arrow cross, to save bullets apparently, they would tie them together, 3, and shoot one, and throw the 3 of them in the water, and that way all 3 of them would drown. And this is how they were killed in Budapest. Well, we escaped and we got back. And we knew, my mother knew that we were about to be liberated. We're going to be liberated soon. And we heard the cannons closer and closer. And there were some close calls, but I remember my mother sitting across from me as we were talking. And all of a sudden, I saw 7 holes in the wall. And there were bullets from an airplane passing. And so we knew that the liberation was going to be imminent. And so we were watching, and there was on the side street where we were living. So we were facing this way, but on the side street here. So we had a window on that side and a window on the front. And I would run from one window to the other and look. And on the side street, I noticed, and my mother noticed, that the Germans were digging up the cobblestone street. And it was to prevent any tanks from crossing, to going in there. And as they were doing that, I was part of that liberation. I'll tell you in a moment, because while they were doing that, I ran to the other side, and we saw some tanks coming closer, and we felt it was imminent. So I ran back to the first window, opened it, and I threw a chair out. It wasn't our chair. I threw a chair out, and hopefully it hit one of the Nazis down there. I don't know, but I'm assuming. So, and my mother didn't scream at me. She was a disciplinarian. I think she welcomed the fact that I got rid of that chair. So we got liberated that day. We got liberated. 2 tanks came along. Some Russians emerged from one of the tanks. They came around to the side where the Nazis had dug up the cobblestones, and they were shooting back and forth, and eventually I think there were about 10 Nazis. They were all killed by the Russians. So here we were. We were now liberated. But there were some events with the Russians that were getting difficult. I mean, we were liberated, but there was a guy named Weinberg, a watchmaker, who was in our building, and he got killed. Why did he get killed? Some Russians found a grandfather clock, and they took it to him, and they said, "Make us 10 watches and give us back the change." When Weinberg explained that you cannot make watches out of a grandfather clock, they shot and killed him. So that was one incident. The other one was a 17-year-old girl having been raped by 6 or 7 Russian soldiers. And subsequently, there were some other incidents. One of them I'll share with you. My mother, who spoke Russian, by the way, she noticed that the soldiers outside were cooking soup. They were making soup. What they were doing is using a spent cannon shell as a pot, and they would put stuff in it, and they would make the soup. And my mother taught me, said, listen, take a pot down, tell them, dai mo malo soup, give me some soup. And then tell them, mami kachwora, my mother is sick, and they will give you the soup. So I went downstairs and I did exactly that. And one soldier said to the other, he'll give it to you in the doorway. And I followed him to the doorway. I didn't quite understand. And what he did is urinate in my pot. And I ran away. I ran back. I didn't get the soup. So that was the other incident. And I'll tell you one more with the Russians, and then I'll move on. Is some weeks later, I mean, we were free and all that, but some weeks later, a group of them came to our apartment. And one of them asked, there were four of them, and one of them asked where my mother sleeps. And while he was talking, I started edging over to him, and I lunged for his gun. And he grabbed me and lifted me and said something to me in Russian. And they gave me a kiss, and they left, all four of them. And apparently what he said to my mother, he was going to make a great Russian soldier. I was going to make a great Russian soldier. So that was the other incident. But right after that, my mother has heard that there were some Zionist organizations in Hashomer HaTzair in Budapest for adults, and there was another place for Dror Habonim for children, so that we were going to move there. It would be safe, much safer than being where we are. And that's what we did. So I stayed at the Dror, and my mother was Hashomer HaTzair, and we would go back and forth. So now I'm going to tell you my biggest birthday present I ever got. It was July 23, 1945. I had just turned 11, and at Dror Habonim we were celebrating my birthday. We did it with everybody's birthday. And the director then told me, I have great news for you. Your dad is back. And I ran back from Dror Habonim halfway across Budapest to Hashomer HaTzair and got reunited with my dad. And he was frail. He had been liberated in April by the British, and it took him several months to get to Budapest. And the way he found us was he went from some of the 50-some-odd places where we had lived that he knew, and my mother had left notes on some of them where we were, just in case. She was being very thoughtful, so that's how he found us. And so we were fine, but we wanted to leave Hungary to go to Palestine, Israel. At that time it was Palestine. But the Russians would not give us exit visas, so the Zionist group, they decided that we were going to leave as some foreigners. So they got hold of passports. We all got passports, Greek passports, that said that we were Greeks. And but then the question was, well, when we go away, how are we going to speak Greek? So, do any of you know Jewish prayers? No. Okay. There's a Jewish prayer that goes, Adon Olam Asher Molach B'Terem Kol Yitzim Nivro. So he said, he asked the same question. The group, you know Jewish prayers? Okay, I'm going to say Adon Olam, and the other person points to a person and they said Asher Molach, and he said, the term call, Yitziniva. Now you speak Greek. So that's how we would communicate. We would communicate while we tried to get out of Budapest. But how we're going to get out of Budapest? Well, in those days, there were some locomotives that were in disrepair, and some people would fix it up, and they would use the locomotives to drag us wherever we would go. And so the Zionist group got hold of two cattle cars. One of them they were going to use for ammunition, but the other one is that would transport us with that locomotive outside of Hungary, getting out of Hungary. And we did. That's what we did. One night we successfully left Hungary, and we were in Yugoslavia. We were heading to Greece, toward Greece, in order to get to a boat that would take us to Palestine. And when we got to the Greek border, there was some kind of an uprising, and it was too dangerous, the adults thought, for us to go into Greece at that time. So we were going to double back to another place that the leader of the Zionist group knew, in Torino, Italy, where we were going to stay and then leave for Palestine from Italy instead of Greece. And that's what we did. It was a huge ride, but we went back through Yugoslavia into Italy and in Torino, and we were told that one day, because in those days Palestine was occupied by the British, and it would be illegal. They would not permit us to enter, so we would have to enter illegally, and so it was kept a secret when we would go and what ship we would take. And one day the trucks came, and we were put on the truck, and promptly the leader of the truck transport ordered me and another boy and our parents to leave, to get off the truck. Why? He explained that when the ship moors off the shore of Palestine, about 200 yards, what they do is they pay out some ropes, the adults pay out some ropes from the ship to shore, and then people sneak off holding on to the rope. But in my case, and this other boy's case, we were too short to reach the rope. So my dad said, but I'll carry him. And he said, that will endanger the group. You can't do it. So they left, and we were left behind. And that is when my parents decided we were going to come here. But how we're going to do it, my mother had a grand-uncle living here, and she says, well, I'm sure he'll help us out. He'll send us a passport. And, but how we're going to get there, where we're going to go. So my dad said, well, he had a brother who lived in Belgium. We were going to go to Belgium. So to do that, we went from Torino to Ventimiglia, Italy, which was bordering France. And in Ventimiglia, we asked a fisherman to row us into France. It was dangerous in those days because after the war, France and Italy, they were enemies. So it was a somewhat tense-filling trip. At one point, there was a patrol boat in the distance. When we were on the ship, the fishermen tied me to the front as their lookout. I spoke a little Italian by then, and they rewarded me to be a lookout. And sure enough, I saw in the distance, I saw a patrol boat, and I remember the fishermen were crossing themselves because we were in danger. Apparently, they used to shoot us, but they didn't shoot us. We were fine. We managed to get into France, and we ended up in Nice. In in Nice, and my parents went to this Jewish organization, the Hayas, for some help. But while we were waiting, I was anxious to see palm trees and the ocean. And my dad says, "I'll take you." And while we were waiting, so he got directions and we wandered off. Have any of you been to Nice? Okay, so the Promenade des Anglais, okay? We went to the water, and I remember my dad and I were sloshing around the water a little bit. And then we went to this wide avenue in Nice, Promenade des Anglais, and stood across the street from what is called the casino. It's no longer a casino now, but it was a casino then. And two men emerged. Two men emerged from the casino wearing white jackets. And my dad said to me, "They are famous people," because people were asking their autographs. He said, "One of them is a man named Charles Boyer, and the other one is Maurice Chevalier." And I remember, and I wrote this down, as I was standing there across the way from these famous people, I thought I would never be able to cross the wideness of this avenue to be where these wonderful men are. So I'm going to skip ahead and then I'll come back. When I came to the United States, which I did in 1949, eventually I became an agent at the William Morris Theatrical Agency. And one job I had at one point is to book a tour for Maurice Chevalier. And I booked, the first date I booked was in Indianapolis, and I flew out, and I bought a bottle of French champagne and some glasses, and I never met him before. And I met him, and I speak French, and we had a nice conversation, and all I realized that day is that immigrant boy from the other day just crossed that avenue. So it was a nice little postscript. So coming back to when, from Nice, we got to Brussels. We stayed 3 years. We made some adjustments. My parents vacationed. My dad worked with his brother a little, and my mother had me take violin lessons and stuff. So it was normalizing. And then, after 3 years, we received our visa, and we took a boat, the SS Washington, to come here. And one more incident that happened that I remembered was when we arrived in the United States, the ship stopped in front of the Statue of Liberty. In those days, to allow the immigration officials to come on board to sign off our documents. And it was early in the morning, and the sun was shining from the back of me. And I was standing on the deck, facing the Statue of Liberty. And I was just looking at it, just fascinated by it. And I was waiting for my turn to be called so I could have my papers signed. And my parents were getting it signed. But while I was waiting there, I noticed my shadow in front of me. And one of the immigration officials came and communicated to me in a language I understood. And this is what he said. He says, "Young man, you just reached a country where you will be as tall as your shadow." And anyway, we arrived in the United States, and let me read you just my conclusions. In addition to the languages I speak, experience thing the Holocaust taught me was to speak one more language, the language of tolerance. I want to accept anyone and everyone in my life, notwithstanding who they are, their religion, origins, etc. I was successful passing this ethos on to my children and grandchildren, who have evolved into the most admirable human beings. For that I am grateful, and to you for letting me share my story with you. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
When you came to the United States, were you a paid passenger or were you a displaced person?
Well, I guess I was a displaced person, yes.
Well, displaced persons, the government, the U.S. government paid for them. And
No, I'm sorry.
Did you have a sponsor?
I misunderstood that. No, I was paid by Hillel. Hillel paid, highest paid, this is a Jewish organization. They paid for my passage to come here, but I came, I had the documents, and eventually it took me 5 years, I became a citizen after 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they were your sponsor.
They were the ones who paid for our passage.
Okay.
My uncle, my granduncle,
Okay, there we go.
was the one who provided the documents. But it was formalized. Eventually we all became citizens.
Great story. True.
Everybody, yes.
When the Soviets or Russians came during like the tussle with the Nazis, were you ever afraid that they would have taken you back to the Soviet Union and you would have been taken to like a Soviet internment camp?
No, but my parents were aware of what had happened in Russia beforehand. No, we were separate from that, but what they did is they restricted us. We couldn't leave Budapest. So, by the way, the other thing that happened is the inflation was enormous at that point, right after that. What I remember in the morning, if you had the dollar there was penger. If you had a penger in the morning, let's say to buy a bread, at the end of the day, if to have that penger be a penger, you had to go to a post office and buy a stamp for 3 pengers and put it on that, and then it became so there was a tremendous amount of inflation. So you would see people with baskets of money trying to buy things. So it was really difficult. It was still difficult, but it was better than what we had during the war because there was some food available. One of the things, by the way, that I got sick, my mother and I both got sick after the war, is she fed me something that I claimed I had never seen in my life, and they were eggs. I claimed I never saw eggs until after the war. So she made me some eggs. Later in the year, she told me she made me something like 6 or 8 or whatever, and she mixed it with salami, and we both got very sick for a while. Yeah. Yes, that's it? Yes.
In 1944, when you left your apartment and you went to the front lines,
Oh yes.
what was the purpose of going to the front line?
Because we wanted to reach the Russians. We were very
The
vulnerable.
Russians were there. In
The Russians were not there yet. They were on the edge of Budapest. They were fighting. They were invading Budapest. So we wanted, or maybe I wasn't clear, but we wanted to get away from the Nazis, and we felt a certain safety in being on the Russian front line, which it was to some extent, but there were some attendant cruelties. They were big thieves, by the way. They stole a lot. And I remember seeing, by the way, one of them being killed by another one and stuff. Yeah. Yes.
When your father got back from the concentration camp in Germany,
Yes.
did he ever share any of the stories with
No.
you? No.
I had a lot of difficulties with him. Only one time did he share it with me on a limited basis. But in effect, it was passed on to me because when Daniel and Erica were growing, initially I made very little, I made very limited talk about my background. I didn't talk about it. There were several reasons. One, it would make me cry. I had a lot of difficulties in talking about it. But the other one was, I read that children feel guilty for parents who were in the Holocaust. So I tried not, I didn't talk about it until 1990, when my daughter, who was a teacher, asked me to accompany her and other teachers to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And when we were on the bus, the leader learned that I was a Holocaust survivor and asked me to talk, and I wouldn't stop talking, just like now. Yeah. Yes.
So you're an only child?
Yes, I'm an only child. Yes. And I'll tell you a little more of it. There's a reason why I'm an only child. I puzzled over the fact that I was born in 1934, 30 miles from the border of Germany, when at that point, synagogues were being burnt down in Germany. The Jews were being imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp and other places. They lost their citizenship, and all this information was filtering over to where my parents were living. And then, lo and behold, I am born. And one day, my mother, years later, in some conversation, said, you were accidental. But she accepted me, so it was... Yes.
Do you have any communication with people that you were with at that time, now?
I'm sorry?
Do you have any communication, or do you have any...
With Holocaust survivors?
Yes, that you were with at that time?
No, I don't have. I do have, at this point, I have one cousin, first cousin, who's a survivor from Auschwitz. I lost some other ones. You know, my generation is dying off,
Yeah.
obviously. I don't have. And I'll tell you, though, I try not to go to the meetings of Holocaust survivors because it's a little controversial what my thinking is. I don't think of myself really as a Holocaust, as a Holocaust victim, but I'm a survivor. And when you get together with a group, the interaction between them is, a lot of them say, what are you talking about? You know what happened to me? It's that competition. And I know it's inevitable. And a lot of them, they treat themselves as being victims. In fact, in my family, to be fair, my mother was a survivor, ready to move on with her life, not my dad. My dad was a victim. And it was painful to see that. He was a gentle, kind, and very considerate man, but he was aching. He was hurting until he died. And he died at 59. Yeah. Yes?
What helped you to heal from like all of the trauma?
What
helped you to heal the most?
What to heal?
Yeah.
Well, even though I'm talking about the past, I'm looking to the future, to my future. I always, I feel I want to be positive about my life, notwithstanding what my past is. In effect, you listening to me telling the story, you're doing me a favor. It's a catharsis for me just to empty my soul here about it. But I'm enjoying, I love my life. I'm enjoying, I have a great grandchild, I have a great son, I have a great family, and I have great relationships with them. I love that. So that helps me. But what is distressing is that to see the deniers, that people are denying that there was such a thing, that there is that, and they're hating it, they're hating. That's why I say the language of tolerance is so important, that we tolerate one another. Yes, ma'am.
After the war, you said you lived with your uncle in Belgium. Did your uncle survive the war in Belgium?
Yes,
I mean,
he
how
was,
was that
yes,
for
he lived in Sudetenland with my dad, with us. He lived in Sudetenland, and when my parents decided to escape to Prague, that's because it was a short distance from where we were living. And at that time, Leopold, my uncle, who was a single, he decided he was going to move to another country, which was Belgium, and tried to persuade my dad to do that, and my dad said it's too far because we have a newborn child, practically, a young child. I don't want to go that far. And I think that was another reason he felt it would be better if we go overseas rather than to another country. It didn't matter. But that's how my Leopold went to Belgium, and he lived there during the war.
So that was a better place to live during the war if you were Jewish?
For some, not for others. He succeeded, but he had some problems in Brussels as well. There were some problems there as well. But he managed. He managed better than we did because my dad was imprisoned and the bombings we had constant bombings at one point. It was where we were living in the cellar downstairs. Yes.
How did your father get away from the camp that he was in?
From
From
camp?
the camp that he was,
The concentration camp?
yeah.
He was liberated on April 10th by the British. And then he managed to traipse around to get from one place to another to get back to Budapest. Yeah. Yes,
How old were you when you came to the U.S.?
15. I was 15 years old. Yes.
Have you been back to
I went back once to Budapest. Yes, I went back, and now I've been approached about doing a documentary about that book. And if we're going to do it, then I think I'm going to go back and film some of the scenes that happened. For instance, the one where my mother feigned death, the building where we were living and where we were liberated. I would want to go back. I have some ideas for some scenes. Yeah.
Were you ever curious about the things that happened with your father? Was it just something that you...
I was.
Yeah, it was just something.
But I could not get answers from him. Yes, I was, and or he would answer me in a very circumspect way. He did not communicate about it. It was just, he was in pain. I think I answered all the questions.
Probably stay here all day. Well, you are absolutely an inspiration. Talking about being a survivor and not a victim, I mean, that's